All right. Well, welcome everyone, and thank you for being here. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Duncan Camuyu to our seminar series. We were really fortunate to hear from him on Wednesday about his pathway to science, and now we get to hear about his research on wildlife conservation in East African savannas. So Dr. Kimuyu received his Bachelor of Science and Master's of Science in Wildlife Management from Moi University, and received his PhD in ecology from the University of Nairobi in 2016, studying cattle, wildlife, and fire interactions in savanna ecosystems. He's currently a lecturer and the head of the Department of Natural Resources at Karatina University in Kenya, and as well as the project manager of the Kenya Long-Term Exclosure Experiment at the Mpala Research Center. Dr. Camuyu's research focuses on wildlife conservation in anthropogenic ecosystems, particularly in understanding the responses of wildlife biodiversity to anthropogenic drivers of change like prescribed fires, the loss of large mammals, and then the intensification of livestock grazing. So I'm particularly excited to welcome Dr. Camuyu, as a few members of the Hallett Lab have started to collaborate on the Kenya long-term exclosure experiment. So we're really lucky to be able to host him and hear his expertise on wildlife conservation and the role of these large herbivores in savanna ecosystems. So with that, I will turn it over to you, Dr. Camuyu. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Carmen, and really great to be here, and happy that people you could be able to join. So I'm really just going to go straight to my talk, and I've titled my talk as Conservation Lessons from Large Mammal Manipulations in East Africa. I'll be talking about some of the work that I've been doing, but also sharing with you a greater part of work that is not necessarily my work, but involved with as part of the Kenya long-term exclosure experiment. So I want to first talk about just global distribution of savannas. And one of the things that we realize with savannas is that they are widely distributed, occurring almost in every continent, and they form 26% of the Earth's surface. Most of these, again, are in tropical areas, and tropical savannas constitute around 68%, and a greater majority of savannas are found here in Africa, where they cover almost half of the continent. They support large populations of people, but also they are greatly renowned for their abundance and diversity of different large mammal herbivores, more diverse than anywhere else on Earth and more abundant than anywhere in the planet. The large mammals that you find in this system remind us or further or give us indication of what the world used to be in other systems when such mammals also existed. We know that in recently, around 15,000 years, we could see similar ecosystems with similar animals in North America, in Australia, 40,000 years ago, and 250,000 years ago in Eurasia, and forces us to think about questions related to whether some of the legacy effects of having these large mammals, now that are extirpated, still exist in the system. And here in Africa, we have a system where such mammals still exist, and we have opportunity to study them and even interrogate questions around what could happen in a system that has been dominated by such great diversity of herbivores when they get extirpated. Of course, we know it's not a happy story. Wildlife in Africa is decreasing, and decreasing so in a very fast rate. These are the last two individuals of northern white rhino in the whole Earth, in the whole planet, and the future of these species is just dependent on these two species, both females and no males exist, and there are efforts being done to revive these species. Of course, the story of northern white rhino is not isolated. There are many other species that are at the brink of extinction facing similar pressures. Elephants, for some time, whose population is now recovering, are also facing similar concerns, and black rhino and many, many other species. Others are also going to extinction silently, and it forces us to think about what are the implications of having these animals in the ecosystem, and what do we lose if we lose them. Laikipia ecosystem, where I do most of my work, is an exception to, in some way, that unlike in many other ecosystems where populations of large mammals are decreasing, recent surveys indicate that, in fact, the population of elephants and many other large animals is increasing. And this is true for only a few ecosystems here in Kenya. There is the Kwale Kilifi area, and there is also Kajiado area where elephants have also been reported to increase. But don't be deceived, this increase could also imply that animals are moving from other areas where there is high disturbance and moving into Laikipia and other ecosystems that are relatively safe. So in as much as you're seeing increase in some of these ecosystems, it does not necessarily point to net increase in wildlife populations for these species. Rather, it could be a net decrease where animals are moving away from disturbed areas. And you can see in most of the other counties, there's decrease in wildlife populations. Systems like this in Laikipia help us to think about what is it in the system that still allows wildlife to increase while we are seeing decrease in most of the other areas. I should point out here that Laikipia is mainly composed of diverse land use, but mostly dominated by private ranches and communal ranches. And when we talk of private ranches, we're talking of large chunks of land owned by private individuals. And this could take different dimensions where land is managed mainly for livestock production, or it's managed for wildlife, or a mix of both, where we have private ranches that are managed basically to maintain the balance between livestock and wildlife population. I should also point out that here in Laikipia, we don't have any government protected area, unlike in other parts of the country. So really, the survival of wildlife is at the mercies of landowners, whether they are communal ranch owners or private ranch owners. It's really something that has to exist at the goodwill of the landowners in this particular system. The Kenya long-term exclosure experiment that I'll be talking about is based in Laikipia, and it consists of a series of herbivore exclosures that were set up by Truman Young in 1995. They have been existent all this time, counting 26 years now. And one thing about these exclosures is that they are located in black cotton soil. I'll be talking more about black cotton soil and how unique a soil community is. But one thing to point out here is that this system is dominated by only one tree species, the Acacia drepanalobium, whistling thorn acacia, the one you see on the picture on the left there. It's a very widespread species, and you find it in mostly in black cotton soil system that are highly consisted of clay, with high clay content. They are less diverse, but also have more nutrient levels than other soil systems. Some of the animals I interact with in these exclosure plots include elephants, giraffes, zebras, hartebeest, oryx, and steinbok. So these are some of the common animals, but not to say that they are the only animals you find in this system. Of course, there are many other animals, including carnivores and other even cryptic herbivores like rodents and things that you don't imagine have impact, but then we'll be talking about some of those implications around based on our findings from our experiments. So the way the exclosures are set up is that we have a series of fences that are designed to keep away different combinations of herbivores. There is, of course, this kind of continuous, I apologize, it's not very clear, but it's a high strand, 6-strand fence that basically keeps away most of the large mammal species, anything bigger than the size of steinbok. And then the next set of a fence is this high strand fence that allows most of the animals to walk through, but keeps away elephants and giraffe. We call this mega herbivore fence because it keeps away large herbivores, mostly the elephants and giraffe, but allows everything else to go underneath. And then they, of course, the open plots that allow herbivores to come in. Of course, one of the things that occurs when you set up experiments like this in such a system, you realize very quickly that elephants are also trying to study you as you try to study them, and they break fences, and they do so very religiously. And this is more prevalent when, for example, when it's dry and they want to get into the exclosures. And it's not just elephants that are full of mischief, but even little things like steinbok would sniff the fence and sometimes jump through. This is steinbok. I should point out our fences do not really control the movement. They can jump in and out of the fence, but anything bigger than steinbok is able to, the fences can keep them away. Lions are also full of mischief. This is one of the pictures of a lion grabbing one of my camera. It's not very clear. When you set up camera traps, lions, of course, want to interrogate and see what is happening. So this is just grabbing one of the camera traps. And you can see here again, not clear. It's with a camera trap on its mouth. So you got to deal with all these different mischievous animals that are also curious about what you're trying to study, just as you're curious about the systems that they occupy. The design of the exclosures is that there are 6 different kinds of treatments representing different herbivore combinations. And the letters here, maybe if I can just point out, because we'll be referring to them, HEM is abbreviation for mega herbivores. And when you talk about mega herbivores in this system, we are basically talking about elephants and giraffe. W is for mesoherbivores, anything smaller than elephant and giraffe. And then C is for cattle. So when you talk about MWC, we're really talking about a plot that allows mega herbivores, mesoherbivores, and cattle to come in. And this is essentially unfenced plot, not fenced at all, allowing all these different animals to come in. And then we have the high strand fence that I showed you that keeps away elephants. So we have a system that has mesoherbivores and cattle, but keeps away elephants. And then another set of plot that is fenced to keep away all large wild herbivores, but allows cattle to come in. Then in this those are 3 treatments. Then we have another set of treatment now without cattle, but similar design. Mega herbivores and meso herbivores without cattle, meso herbivores without cattle, and all representing plots that we have kept away everything, including cattle. Each of the plot is 200 by 200 meters, obviously small at the scale of movement of most of the animals that we try to manipulate, but still allowing us to get insights about changes in the vegetation community and responses of different combinations of herbivores to our treatments. So entirely, we have 18 plots. So each of these 6 treatments is replicated 3 times in 3 blocks. So the full design constituting 18 different herbivore plots. As I pointed out, they are all located in a relatively homogeneous system, the black cotton soil ecosystem. Some of the ways you can think about this experiment is that it represents different management regimes. Management regimes to the extent that you could have portions, just like I pointed out, Laikipia is a land of diverse land uses. And we have areas that are being set away for wildlife, areas that are being set away for cattle, areas that combine cattle and wildlife. And we also have areas that don't have cattle and wildlife, and so on and so on. So you can really think about this experiment as just a one-stop shop where you can walk in and see all these different scenarios of land use and what the implications for them would be to vegetation and to other communities. You could also think about this as representing different extinction scenarios where you start speculating what could happen in a system that has always had elephants when you remove elephants from the system, or when you remove all wild ungulates from the system, or even when you remove cattle, or different combinations, and then you can see what the implications would be to the community, to the herbaceous community and other interactions. Recently, and by recent I mean 2013, we started, in addition to these different layers of herbivore manipulations, we also started experiments with fire. So what happened in each of these exclosures, we went ahead and burned small portions, 30 by 30 meters. I said the exclosures are 200 by 200 meters, so just small portion of the plot. And we are interested in questions relating to how fire could interact with different herbivore treatments and what the responses would be to vegetation. So this is just showing one of the burnt plots immediately after, while we are still burning it. And I would say that it's very rare to get systems like this or experiments like this that use combinations of different herbivore treatments and interact that with fire. And this exclosure experiment allows us to test some of those questions related to changes in vegetation when under different grazing regimes. So I was going to share with you some of the key findings that we've been able to find from looking at various aspects of this angle. Of course, we don't have enough time to go through every little thing that we have found, but I'll try to summarize some of the results that are exciting, and we often refer to this as our best hits, or in a way, some of the cool things that we are getting and some of the insights that we are generating from this system. So one of the things is obviously the response of the herbaceous community. When you set away plots, you remove different combinations of herbivores. You expect the herbaceous layer to change. And within 5 years of this existence of this experiment, we started noticing changes in the herbaceous community. And some of the dominant things to point out here is that cattle really seem to be a major influence, or to have major influence on grass cover, to the extent that plots that have cattle remain almost with low herbaceous cover. But then the plots that have excluded cattle, we got increase in herbaceous cover, particularly increase in grass cover. And this is true for every additional herbivore you include or you exclude from the system, such that plots that are completely not grazed obviously have more grass cover. We didn't expect elephants would have much influence on forbs, but then it turns out that elephants have major implications on the forb community, so that plots that have elephants remain with low forb, but plots that do not have elephants, forb diversity, forb cover increased. Another thing related to cattle and management of cattle in this system relates to the idea that plots that are grazed by cattle during the dry season, the period following dry season, they get more diverse herbaceous community. And this just could point to the idea that, you know, cattle are keeping the grass layer low and opening niches for establishment of more diverse community. So some level of grazing could point to maintaining diversity in the system. While on the contrary, plots that do not have as much grazing during the rain season also remain with low diversity. So a little piece there to think about grazing is really important in maintaining herbaceous community diversity. We've also been looking at these trajectories in changes in herbaceous layer over time. And what I'm displaying here is the idea that community structure is more driven by herbivory and drought, such that if you think of this as the beginning of our herbaceous community, we're seeing the beginning of our vegetation monitoring. Then you start seeing communities, or you start seeing the different plots diverging from each other in a way that could point to the idea that herbivores maintain the diversity, or herbivores contribute to the trajectories that we are seeing, so that under different combinations of herbivores, you are getting different end results over time. Again, also related to the drought, that drought seems to bring everything close, but then the period immediately after drought, you get more diverse responses. What is happening to the hoodie community? Again, something that we could have easily speculated, you know, it's soil, it's black cotton soil community. It's intolerant. Most of the species are not capable of surviving there because of the heavy clay content, the shrinking and swelling and the cracking of the soil. You'd imagine that it's tearing roots of trees and making the environment very hostile for most of the trees. And you could even say, you know, Acacia drepaniobium turns out to be the species that is quite adapted to dealing with that kind of stress. But how wrong could you be? Because after setting the exclosure experiments for this long, we are beginning to see different species of trees, again, doing equally well in this ecosystem. So in plots that have excluded different have excluded all herbivores, you get more different. So this is the number of trees of different species other than Acacia drepanalobium, the dominant tree. And you almost get, uniform increase in number of individuals and also increase in diversity of woody species in plots that have excluded herbivores. So you could think of this, that herbivores, exclusion of these different herbivores is, contributing to increase in diversity of woody species. Or you could think of it the other way around, that herbivores are maintaining low diversity of woody species in this ecosystem, and therefore they are a major part of the equation. The other question that has been interesting to us relates to the responses of wildlife to these different combinations. For example, when you put cattle together with wildlife, you expect some interactions in terms of grazing interactions and responses. So by monitoring wildlife visitation of different plots using dung count, we are able to establish that actually wildlife avoid plots that are grazed by cattle. And this applies not only to wildlife species that are grazers, but also species that are mixed feeders like eland and Grant's gazelle. So in every plot that has cattle, you get reduction in utilization of those plots, pointing to the negative impact of cattle to wildlife, which easily, could easily translate to competition for pastures. And one thing with cattle, plots that are grazed with cattle, they tend to have low grass cover than plots that are not grazed by cattle. But then the equation changes a little bit when you bring elephant into the equation. So the plots that are indicated in green there represent plots, similar treatment, wildlife with cattle, wildlife without cattle, but then the green ones indicate where you have mega herbivores, again, with cattle or without cattle. And if you focus on just the reduction, you realize that overall, the reduction of wildlife densities or wildlife utilization of our plots is much less when you have mega herbivores as part of the equation. So this is the graph on the left is the net reduction without mega herbivores, or net reduction in wildlife use without mega herbivores. And the other panel is net reduction with mega herbivores. So indicating that mega herbivores can actually reduce this adverse effect we are seeing of cattle on wildlife. But then what's the mechanism behind that? Obviously, you start interrogating things about tree cover and whether by reducing tree cover, elephants are creating more room for grass to grow and therefore mitigating the negative impact of cattle. But it could also relate to behavioral modifications of grazing behavior of cattle. And one of the things that we can zoom in and look into is just looking at how zebras are responding. Zebras are grazers in this ecosystem. So if you think about zebra dung density and the total grass cover, then you almost see a linear pattern that with increase in grass cover, you get more zebra dung piles, meaning zebras are preferring to graze in areas that you have more grass cover. And in which plots do you have more grass cover? Plots that do not have cattle. MW and MWC have more grass cover than plots that have cattle. So ideally, cattle are reducing grass cover and as a consequence, also reducing zebra presence in this exclosure experiment. It gets a little complicated when you start thinking about what are the implications of mega herbivores again in this system. So look at W, it's a plot without mega herbivores, and WC, it's a plot again without mega herbivores but with cattle, and compare the net reduction in zebra density. So W and WC represents much greater reduction in zebra density. Compare that with MW and MWC, you realize that the reduction in zebra density is much less when you have mega herbivores as part of the equation. And ideally, what we are pointing to this is that elephants increase grass cover with, of course, positive implications to zebras. And in absence of elephants, you don't get that impact. So another kind of unexpected reaction that elephants could mitigate this negative impact we are seeing of cattle on wildlife. Another thing that we also have been able to demonstrate, still on the theme of cattle-wildlife interaction, relates to the idea that cattle are competing with wildlife more during dry season, and in fact, it changes during the wet season. And what Wilfred Odadi has been able to demonstrate with this plot is that when you put cattle together with wildlife, they gain more weight, they lose more weight during the dry season, but come wet season, they gain more weight, pointing to the idea that cattle are benefiting from presence of wildlife during the dry season, but losing to presence of wildlife during the wet season. Another unexpected responses points to rodents. And as I pointed out earlier, cattle are reducing grass cover. And as a consequence, when you exclude cattle from the system, you get more grass cover. And more grass cover translates to more rodents. And more rodents points to more fleas. The graph here on the left shows the number of fleas vis-a-vis the number of rodents in the system. And this could have implications on disease in this particular system. So really by excluding cattle, you're getting more grass and more rodents and potential increase in disease pathogens like fleas. Also related to that is what is happening to ticks. We know ticks are important vectors for diseases. And again, when you exclude cattle, you get more ticks, particularly because most of the livestock management practices involve spraying cattle with acaricides to, kill ticks. It turns out when you spray cattle with acaricides, wherever they graze in the system, any tick that tries to climb on the cattle again falls off. So the net effect is that in plots where you have grazed cattle, you get overall reduction in tick population, and generally you'd imagine a landscape that is grazed by cattle to have fewer ticks, and of course there are implications on disease for when you have more ticks or less ticks. Something else we've been curious about relates to nutrient fluxes in this system. And Judith's sisters are being able to demonstrate that nutrients in the soil vary depending on the different herbivore treatments. And the graphs here show variations in soil carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus in each of the different plots underneath trees, the golden colors, and outside tree canopies and underneath tree canopies. And what I want to point out here are the plots with cattle, that is C and MWC. They all seem to have consistently low carbon, low nitrogen, and low phosphorus in the soils. And then Compare that with the next plot, MWC, again, we also with cattle, but now with mega herbivores. So ideally, these two plots without mega herbivores have low carbon, but when you bring mega herbivores in the equation, the level of carbon in the soil is high. So pointing to the idea that mega herbivores can actually reverse this negative impact of cattle on soil carbon. And what is happening when you're grazing cattle in the system is that, you know, they're harvesting grass and forage and depositing elsewhere in the dung, in form of dung. So when you graze them, they are net exporters of carbon. But then when you graze them together with mega herbivores, then you don't get that impact. Some of the pathways that mega herbivores could be reducing the negative impact of cattle relate to the idea that elephants are also knocking down trees and, you know, integrating carbon into the soil through trees, but also could point out to the idea that elephants do suppress forage extraction by cattle. And we have seen this because in plots that are grazed by elephants, when you bring in cattle, they spend less time foraging. They spend more time moving around. And what's the mechanism for that? The idea that elephants, as I pointed out earlier, that they are reducing forbs. By reducing forbs, they influence indirectly grazing behavior of cattle. I should point out that forbs are, if you want to say, the spices of life in this particular ecosystem, because they are loaded with nitrogen, with you know, nutrients that the cattle are looking for. So when you graze the cattle in this system, they spend more time looking for those forbs and harvesting them within the grass layer. What happens if elephants had walked ahead of the cattle? They have, of course, removed those forbs. And as a consequence, cattle spent more time grazing or moving around, and eventually they take less grass in plots that have been grazed by cattle. Another, you know, indirect interaction happening there. Another thing related to livestock management in this system, not necessarily in our plots, relates to the corralling behavior, where you graze cattle in the landscape, put them in these kind of exclosures at night, dung accumulates there, and the moment you move them, you leave behind these patches of treeless glades that are dominated by highly nutritious grasses, and these features become permanent aspects of heterogeneity in this system, such that when you look at it from a bigger landscape scale, the areas that are there in red have history of having been cattle bombers, and they could last for, you know, centuries in this landscape without trees, but with highly nutritious grasses. And this is where herbivores aggregate at night, particularly because of better predator visibility, but also because of the nutrients in the grasses. And we're seeing, you know, another aspect of cattle management, introducing heterogeneity in a system that would otherwise be quite homogeneous. I want to pause there and quickly talk about fire as another aspect of management in this system. And fire is particularly important because we know that the system, most savannas have evolved with fire as a dominant player, maintaining the tree cover and interactions between herbivores. Here in Laikipia, fire used to be very common, but now it's increasingly rare. And In our exclosure plots, I mentioned that we started fire manipulations to understand aspects of how fire can be used to manage these systems. And this is our setup. When doing control burns, you have to have more people lined up, and just to make sure the fire doesn't go out of hand. This is how some of our fires look like. And one thing with our fire system is that the fire temperature is directly linked to the herbivore treatments, such that plots that have fewer herbivores, of course, have more grass and eventually would have higher fire temperatures. Again, fire is also related to tree density, that plots that have higher tree density also burn at higher temperatures. I mentioned the Acacia drepanorobium as the dominant tree species. One of the questions that people think about when you're using fire or when you're burning or when you're prescribing fires is to control tree encroachment. But it turns out Acacia drepanorobium is highly adapted to fire, and immediately after you burn, almost all trees, including seedlings, copies readily after fire. And this could relate to just the idea that the tree is well adapted to fire. It has thick bark, it has its buds protected, and because of that, it can survive fire quite well. But then what is happening to the ant communities when you burn? There are 4 ant species that live in this tree, and they defend the tree against herbivores. And it turns out most of the ants succumb to fire. So when you burn, a lot of them would die in the fire. And consequently, after fire, you get this kind of thing where elephants come hammering every single tree that is standing. And they preferentially browsing on trees in the burnt areas because the trees are less protected by the ants after fire. So really a network of interactions, and we can go on and on and on, but I desist from going to every single interaction that we are being able to demonstrate in the interest of time, but also again, just to keep it straightforward. But then this just shows many interactions that we've been able to test using these kind of exclosure plots and some of the things that we can demonstrate. We are talking about these interactions between livestock and wildlife. And I want to put a caveat that our experiments only allow us to test these things at moderate stocking densities. We know that overgrazing is a major concern in most of these systems. And where land has been overgrazed, you get obviously reduction in densities. But all we are saying is that at moderate stocking densities, some aspects of livestock production can be compatible with wildlife conservation. Again, by compatibility, we don't mean that there is no conflict. Obviously, there is conflict, but we can mitigate the conflict and increase compatibility depending on the level of stocking density that we are talking about. However, most of the rangelands around are quite overgrazed or are quite degraded. And the things that I've been talking about really represent the past. The future of these systems is quite uncertain because we are seeing patterns, we are seeing trends that could point to much widespread degradation in these systems. And some of the trends we need to worry about in terms of management of this system relates to increase in human population, changes in the livestock species. For example, people are now beginning to switch from camels to grazing, from cattle to camels and goats. That's, of course, a different dimension. Again, change in land tenure where communally owned lands are now being subdivided to individual ownership and small parcels of land. and less mobility for livestock. We also need seeing more and more communities settling down. Previously, you'd expect their pastoralists were nomadic and moving around, but now they are settling around areas where there are social amenities, and that's a different dimension altogether. Also, access to formal education is something that, again, we need to worry about, where kids are increasingly opting to go to school rather than to stay at home and take care of cattle. So this is a new dimension again that could spell, hope for the rangelands in this system. But again, with education comes extra sources of money, and most of the kids that have gotten formal education from most of the pastoral communities are preferring to work in towns and other white-collar jobs, and often investing money back home to buy more livestock and hiring people to herd their livestock. So that's a different dimension altogether. There's also increased opportunities for wildlife-based tourism, and we're seeing more and more enterprises and communities becoming more entrepreneurial, entrepreneuring in setting up tourism, ventures. And when these become more rewarding, are we going to see more switch towards such opportunities as opposed to, herding livestock? Access to livestock markets, again, more and more enlightening to ensure these communities can be able to sell off some of their livestock when it's dry and cannot be supported by the land, and being able to buy when conditions are more ideal. We're seeing cultural transformations. Of course, all these things are tied to culture of people, and culture is so dynamic, and what we are seeing now could be very different in future. So what's the future of these communities likely to look like? Also, we're seeing widespread degradation in areas that have been overgrazed. So how is that likely to affect future trajectories in these systems? These are things, of course, that I don't have answers for now, but they are things that, of course, point to the idea that we need more science, we need more research in this system to find ways in which these things can be managed together in the same landscape. Otherwise, we can easily end up with degraded systems like this, where most of the cover has been cleared, and we're getting more soil erosion and invasive species, and every other drought affects the community more intensely than the previous one. So I'll stop there and check any comments or questions in the interest of time.
Thank you so much, Duncan. That was really good. Yeah, we'll open it up for any questions. You can feel free to unmute yourself and speak up, or throw questions in the chat and I can read them out. Looks like we've got a question from Monica here. She's curious, how is the law in Laikipia if a wild mammal wanders into private land? Is the landowner forbidden to attack them? I think is the first question. And then, do landowners have a lot of cattle in the area? And if yes, how come Laikipia has such a good increase in wild mammal populations, even though they have to compete with cattle? Yeah.
Cool. The first question, what happens when wild animals move to or wander around private ranches? It really depends on the inclination of the ranch owner. As I pointed out, there are private landowners that are tolerant of wildlife. There are those that are antagonistic about wildlife. And obviously, wildlife in Kenya is owned by the government, and even individual ranch owners have no right over land in their private properties. And oftentimes what people do to stop wildlife from coming to their land is to fence off their land. Otherwise, if the land is unfenced and animals move in, obviously there is no permission to kill them or harm them or have any utility value on them, because again, wildlife is managed by the government, but individual owners cannot claim any ownership or any rights over the use of wildlife. I don't know whether I remember the second question.
Yeah, I can read it out again. Let's see. Let's see. Does the landowners have a lot of cattle in the area? And then if yes, how is Laikipia, or how do they have a good increase in wild mammal populations, even though the wild mammals are competing with the cattle? And then are the cattle also facilitating the wild mammals during the wet season?
Cool. Yeah, those are great questions. Again, so really what's happening with the increase in wildlife in Laikipia, as I pointed out, relates to what is happening in other areas. And in most of the other areas, there's more habitat degradation, there's more wildlife conflict. Particularly, elephants are moving from other ecosystems, adjacent ecosystems, to Laikipia, and most of them are moving because of conflict. They come to Laikipia with, wounds from bullets, arrows, and all that. And Laikipia turns out to be a relatively more safer environment for them. And you see more migration of them moving into Laikipia, not just because the conditions are perfect or ideal, but just because there is more pressure from other adjacent areas and you're getting more impact on that. The other question related to whether wildlife are also benefiting from cattle during the wet season. I would say yes, but again, put a caveat, it really depends on the intensity of grazing. I pointed out earlier in the presentation that some level of grazing is actually ideal to promote diversity of the herbaceous community and to maintain grasses at high nutritious level. And if you think of cattle as that grazing force that is, preventing grass from overgrowing and getting rank and all that, then you could think about come wet season, wildlife would benefit from such areas that have been grazed by cattle low. And there are whole, sorts of management interventions, pointing to the idea that you can use cattle to regenerate great degraded area. But I don't want to go into that, that kind of discussion. But all I want to think about is, in an area where you have more grass growing during the more dead grass in the dry season, then if you introduce some level of grazing, it will benefit anything that comes in that landscape during the wet season in terms of facilitating more nutritious growth and more diverse community.
Thank you. We have another question in the chat here from Carol. Have the research findings had any impact on how land or wildlife is managed in the county or country? And if so, which ones would be the most actionable?
That's a good question. It's the question that keeps researchers awake at night, thinking about whether whether this research has any impact and whether it's contributing to any solutions. Obviously, we've had many insights from this work that have been adopted in other areas in terms of just how, in terms of practical solutions to management. And one of the things that we've been really emphasizing across the divide is the idea that, when you think about cattle, it's not always competition, it's not always bad impact, but there is a way in which you can manage the two together and maximize compatibility and minimize the conflicts. And this is something that would benefit ranch manager as well as wildlife manager as well, in terms of, facilitating integration of cattle and wildlife and looking at the coin from both sides, that you could be getting some benefits by having that kind of a mix in the system. It's a departure from the traditional wildlife conservation philosophy, where you want to kind of manage wildlife in isolation from people and in isolation from their source of livelihood, which is cattle. But then thinking about like greater proportion of wildlife in Kenya exists outside this, government gazetted protected area, then you got to think about what's the solution for that wildlife that is not within areas that are being set away primarily for wildlife. How do you integrate? How do you manage that? And the solution to that is, finding that balance where you strike moderate grazing intensity, and that way you can facilitate both livestock and wildlife.
Thank you. I had seen a hand up perhaps from Nelson a while ago. Do you still have a question?
Yeah, I think, thank you for the amazing lecture and just really interesting information that you've been able to generate that's very relevant to conservation. I guess my question was related to the same theme that you've been discussing, and then the end of your talk. I was wondering if you can comment on the civil conflict that has occurred in the Laikipia region over the past few years, because it is directly related to this work, like you've kind of alluded to. But I was wondering how you might use this information to try to mitigate human-human conflict that has occurred because of overgrazing that has been happening in Laikipia, which also intersects, I think, with maybe a history of colonialism, and then also maybe future climate change that has been happening.
Mm-hmm. Great. Yeah, that's an interesting dimension. The idea of conflicts. I should point out, about 3 years ago there was conflict involving invasion by local communities into private ranches and in search for pasture. And the genesis for this invasion was because of a prolonged drought. And what happened is that, people were moving with their livestock in search for pastures, and there is always the temptation, to look at the neighborhood ranch, and if there is more grass there, the local communities were moving in with their cattle, and in search for the pastures. And it's the kind that points to the aspect of land degradation that I alluded to earlier, that with degradation of the land, every single drought will be more severe than the other one, because the land is already not able to support enough pastures for grass for the wildlife. And the genesis for this was drought, but also there was some political aspect tied to it, that there was a move towards, historical injustices and how these private ranches were acquired and how they were allocated to a few individuals. And there was a push that it's unfair to have people owning huge tracts of land while the local communities are aggregated into small parcels of land. And it was a push political to reclaim these parcels of land. But then you think of that, and there was a lot of conflict. There was shooting of wildlife involved, and there were some casualties. And of course, the storm has settled down. But then you think about what's the solution in such, confronted with such a dilemma? What's the solution? Is it to turn these private ranches to the local communities? And what would be the scenario if all these huge tracts of land that also host wildlife are turned to the local communities? Of course, there'll be more incentive to have more livestock. And you see a scenario where the same degradation that is happening in the local communities spreading to these now fairly protected, fairly well-managed private ranches. And that, again, just spreads the whole problem, but now countywide. And I'll see the best solution to this, finding solution for the local communities, or finding solutions to restoration of already degraded areas in the local communities, rather than thinking of turning the private ranches to the local communities.
Thank you.
Thanks. Looks like we have another question in the chat. How successfully are fences keeping elephants out of the plots? As the first question. And then secondly, do you use different fire intensities in your fire management?
The first question, fairly effective. Fences, our fences have been quite effective in keeping away elephants for better part of the year. But it's during the dry season when we get most of the problem with elephants, when it's dry. And of course, they looking for that's when you get most of the breakages of the fences, and not just by elephants, but also by other animals. But fairly, we've been quite successful in keeping away elephants from the plots that we do not want them to go. And that's why we are even seeing some of the patterns that we're seeing with the changes in the community structure and all that. But I would say it's not 100% sure that elephants can be kept away, and more so because they learn how to break fences, and we got to move in very fast to repair and also maintain the fences running to keep away the elephants. What was the other question?
The second question was about whether you use different fire intensities in the management.
We per se, we've not prescribed different fire intensities, by the nature of our herbivore treatments, with different cover intensities and tree densities, that in a way, translates to different fire temperatures in each of our plots. So plots that have higher tree cover and more grass cover burn at a higher intensity than plots that are open to herbivores and are being grazed and tree cover is being maintained low. So, but then we haven't pushed that button further to, look at prescribing specific fire intensities and monitoring the implications for that.
Great. Well, thank you everyone for the questions, and thank you again, Duncan, for the wonderful talk. Let's give him another round of applause here. So that's our time for the seminar, but please, everyone, if you have more questions, stick around for the tea time immediately after. Maybe we'll take a short break, but then on this same Zoom link, you can return and continue asking questions. I know there was another one that got put in the chat that we don't have time for right now. So yeah, all right.
Cool. Thank you for having me.
Of course. Thank you so much for